Now, I've alluded to the problem of evil in many other videos, but I don't know that I've ever really taken it on directly. This time, I'm going to, over a series of 2 videos put out by Reasonable Faith. The first one tries to address it from a logical position, and yes, I'm using finger quotes here, but I wanted to get into some depth on why the religious are simply wrong about the problem of evil, and why they don't even recognize what it's trying to go after, and why it's so absolutely devastating to their beliefs. So let's begin.
We are all well aware of the suffering and evil in the world.
A lot of it caused directly by religion and religious belief. Let's not forget that.
Horrific suffering, unspeakable evil. How then can anyone believe in the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God?
That's a good question, although, as with most religious apologists, you're going to completely miss the point of the problem of evil. At least how I see it anyhow.
And if God does exist, why would anyone want to worship him? Epicurus framed the logical problem of suffering and evil like this. If God is willing to prevent evil but not able, then he's not all-powerful. If he is able to prevent evil but not willing, he is not good. But if he is both willing and able, how can evil exist? And if he is neither able nor willing, then why call him God?
All of which are excellent points. But I'm going to stop him here for a moment and put forth my own views on Epicurus and the problem of evil. Because it isn't an argument against the existence of God, but an argument against the arbitrary characteristics the Christians have given to their God. After all, they've got no means whatsoever of actually observing their God to see if he has any of these characteristics. They're just ideas that have been assigned to God, not demonstrably belonging to God. So going back to my favorite example, Harry Potter, all of the adjectives that are used to describe Harry Potter, are those actually characteristics descriptive of him? Or are they just things that have been arbitrarily assigned to him? Well, since Harry Potter isn't real any more than the Christian God is, they're all just invented. Until someone can actually produce Potter or God and we can observe for ourselves that these labels are accurate, there's no reason to take any of them seriously. Therefore, this is an attack on the ideas about God, not on the existence of God. But I guess I'll let him continue now and see where he goes.
In other words, it's logically impossible for God and suffering to both exist.
Well, assuming that all of the characteristics that are assigned to God are true, then yes. But those characteristics are inherently contradictory no matter how you slice it, something that religious apologists have been trying to explain their way around for centuries.
But we know full well that suffering exists. Therefore, God does not.
God, with the characteristics that most Christians ascribe to him, can't exist if evil exists. Now, if you have a different formulation, then we can revisit the question, but as described, it is absolutely impossible for that God to exist if evil exists. Now, this guy's going to have to explain his way around all of that, and I'm sure he's going to try.
Is this a good argument?
It completely demolishes the most common formulation of God, yes.
Let's look at it more closely. Are these two statements logically inconsistent?
Yes, they are, although you're missing, and I suspect on purpose, the omnibenevolent characteristic that pretty much all Christians ascribe to their God. Now, of course, I admit you could be using all-loving for all good, and then I might let that pass, but let's be honest, because if God is all-powerful, meaning they can do anything without restraint, and all good, meaning everything they do is good, then evil simply cannot exist in any world that God creates. Of course, both of these characteristics are inherently contradictory. An all-powerful God can't be all good or incapable of doing evil because then he couldn't be all powerful. But an all good and an all loving God couldn't be all powerful and maintain that distinction. So you got an oxymoron here.
No. Here is an example of two logical inconsistent statements.
But those are actually inconsistent by definition. It's impossible to be both married and a bachelor, which is the state of being unmarried, at the same time. I mean, yeah, they can both describe David at different points in his life, but that's quibbling unnecessarily. By the same token, it's impossible to be both omnipotent and omnibenevolent at the same time, because by definition, being all-powerful means you can do anything, including being evil. But God is supposedly incapable of that, meaning God can't be all-powerful. This whole thing, it's just a mess.
David can't be both married and a bachelor. But there is no explicit contradiction between these two statements.
Actually, there is, again assuming that you're not picking and choosing which implicit characteristics you're going to assign to God, because an all-good God could not create a world where evil is even a possibility, where evil can even take place, where even the concept of evil could exist. If that God creates such a world, then that God can't be all good by definition.
So there must be hidden assumptions behind this argument that would bring out the alleged contradiction.
I've already pointed out the assumptions that you're making, or very carefully hiding, which blows your beliefs completely out of the water. So let's see how he's going to spin this.
Here they are. If God is all-powerful, he can create any world he wants. And if God is all-loving, he prefers a world without suffering.
Nope, sorry. While the first is a precondition of being all-powerful, that you can do anything you want without exception or limit, the second one is not a preference. It's a requirement. If God is all good, then God cannot, by definition, create evil. Now, let's not forget, in the Bible it says that God does create evil. Let's ignore that for a minute. If we're going to define suffering as evil, then God cannot, by definition, create a universe where suffering is even a possibility. Not a preference, a requirement.
So, if an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, it follows that suffering does not exist.
It is definitional that suffering, making the assumption that I've already listed, and a God with the arbitrary characteristics used by most Christians, can't exist. But he's going to try to squirm his way out of that. Just watch.
Since suffering obviously does exist, the atheist concludes that God must not exist.
No. The atheist concludes that the characteristics arbitrarily assigned to God cannot be true because they are logically contradictory and impossible. Going back to his example of David, the married bachelor, we would not conclude that David does not exist because the characteristics assigned to him are contradictory. We'd conclude that the characteristics are simply wrong.
But are the atheist's two hidden assumptions necessarily true?
These are not assumptions that atheists make. These are straw men that our apologist is trotting out so that he can tear them down without actually addressing the core problem of evil.
Consider the first assumption. Can God create any world he wants? What if he wants a world populated by people who have free will?
And that's fine. I recently did a video on free will that I think fits in very well here. Free will, by any rational definition, means being able to freely choose any option available in a rational and logical world. You can't just choose to flap your arms and fly, but that doesn't mean you have no free will. Therefore, man can only choose to do evil because evil is an available option in the existent world. God could very easily have created a world where evil wasn't an option, where the very concept of evil doesn't exist, where suffering was impossible, and man would still have free will to choose from among the available options within that evil-free universe. So this line of reasoning, it just fails miserably.
It's logically impossible for God to force someone to freely choose to do good.
If good is the only option available, then there is no choice because there is no alternative. Now, it's hard to imagine living in such a world. The very concept is foreign to us, but if it's even possible, then God could do it, being all-powerful and all. If I, as a mere mortal, can conceive of the concept, then God should be able to realize it. So why didn't he?
Forcing free choices is like making a square circle. It's not logically possible.
Only in a world where square and circle are mutually contradictory. But God's all-powerful, remember? God not only created the universe and everything in it, but he created the very concepts that the universe is made up of. Up and down, left and right, good and evil. Those are just concepts that God had to purposely create as he did. The universe exists as it does because God wanted it to be this way. But he wasn't limited to how it turned out. It could have been any way he wanted. If he wanted square circles to exist, he could have done so. Theists apparently dramatically underestimate the supposed power of their imaginary friends.
It's not that God lacks the power to perform the task. It's that the supposed task itself is just nonsense.
Then, by definition, God isn't powerful enough to do it. Are you even listening to what you're saying? Christians have to continually dial back these omniproperties because I think even they realize just how asinine they really are. God is all-powerful, but here's a list of things he can't do. Are you serious?
So, it may not be feasible to create a world populated by people who always freely choose to do what is morally good.
Which just means that God is not all-powerful. So we've already disposed of the omnibenevolent characteristic. That's 2 down. How many are left?
So the first assumption is not necessarily true. Therefore, the argument fails.
Christianity fails, assuming that Christianity is based on its particular view of God.
And what about the second assumption? Is it necessarily true that God would prefer a world without suffering? How could we possibly know this?
How could you possibly know any of the things you claim to know about God, including whether or not God exists in the first place? But that doesn't stop you, does it?
We all know of cases where we permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good.
That's because we have no choice in the matter. But we're not supposedly all-powerful, are we? If we could bring about the greater good without any suffering, most people would do it. So what the hell's wrong with God?
If it's even possible that God allows suffering in order to achieve a greater good, then we cannot say this assumption is necessarily true.
Yet now you're moving the goalposts. This isn't about allowing suffering, it's about causing suffering. If you have the ability to end suffering, yet you refuse to do so, that makes you a fundamentally horrible entity. God doesn't permit suffering. God set up the whole system on purpose to force suffering. Your God is a complete asshole.
For the logical problem of suffering to succeed, the atheist would have to show that it's logically impossible that free will exists, and that it's logically impossible that God has good reasons for permitting suffering.
No, we just have to show you that your arbitrary characteristics that you've assigned to your imaginary friend make absolutely no sense given what we see in the real world around us. And we've done that. You're just making excuses.
This burden of proof is too heavy to bear. It's quite possible that God and suffering both exist.
I love how it's now possible. Not true, not likely, just possible. But this is what you get when you go round and round and round on your carousel of rationalizations.
This is why philosophers, even atheist philosophers, have given up on the logical problem of evil.
Except that they haven't. It only takes a quick internet search to find lots and lots and lots of people, even philosophers, that are still talking about it.
We can concede that the problem of evil does not after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another.
Except that quote, taken from chapter 9 of Mackey's book, is completely taken out of context. It makes it sound like Mackey changed his mind, when in reality, he maintained a lifelong feud with Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga over the problem of evil until his death in 1981. Do try again.
Some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of a theistic God. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim.
Because this isn't about the existence of God, but the arbitrary characteristics of God. Come on.
It's now acknowledged on almost all sides that the logical argument is bankrupt.
Sure, that was written in 1991, yet here we have a theist making a video 26 years later because apparently lots of people didn't agree with Mr. Alston. And you notice that he's just trying to make a bunch of appeals to authority, people giving their opinions, sometimes out of context, as though any of it proves a damn thing. All he's really trying to do with any of this is say, "Stop asking me hard questions I can't answer."
But this is hardly the end of the discussion. We still need to explore the probability version of the problem of evil.
And I'll do that in an upcoming video. Sorry to say, it's no more valid than anything that our theist here had to say. But that'll come at a later time. I think this has gone on long enough. So what do you think? Do you think that anything our religious apologist here had to say holds any water whatsoever? Let me know in the comments. The kind of hoops that theists have to jump through to make anything they believe appear even remotely possible. It's kind of silly, isn't it? They have to pick and choose which parts of their own beliefs that they want to acknowledge at the moment and which parts they want to carefully hide away. If you can't be honest about all of it, then your beliefs are too absurd to be taken seriously, which is exactly why many of these responses to the problem of evil either try to dance around the conclusions, lie about the intent, or just make up a bunch of unsupported nonsense along the way in a desperate attempt to maintain relevancy. And I'm sorry to say, it just doesn't work.
Everything changes.